I never realized how connected I felt to the city until the war had started. I was waking up in the middle of the night feeling like a death, feeling like this tragedy overcoming me, overcoming my family, feeling like the place that I come from was just pulled out from under me. And that's when I really understood how connected I feel to this region, to this country, and to the city.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Outline. My name is Sabine Boghossian, and today we're hosting Christine Gedeon. Christine is a visual artist who divides her time between Berlin and New York. She was born in Aleppo, Syria, and raised in the US. Since the start of the war in Syria, her work has focused on her family history in Syria pre-civil war in various mediums, such as sound string installation, works on paper, and works on canvas. Christine's work has appeared in galleries and institutions worldwide, including a solo exhibition at Jane Lombard Gallery in New York in 2018. Christine, welcome. I'm very happy to be hosting you on Outline.
Thank you, Sabine. Very happy to be here.
Now, before we dive into our conversation, I'd like to give our auditors full disclosure about you and me. This is not the first time we actually meet, right?
It's funny what social networking can do. You can find long lost relatives.
Indeed. So Christine and I, we are kind of related, and we met for the first time almost 20 years ago, right? At my grandmother's place in Aleppo.
And had a really interesting reconnection over Instagram when you had found my work and then realized my uncle, who I've been doing projects about, Michel Sade, is a relative of yours on your father's side,
Exactly.
which was quite amazing. And then I realized later, when I found out you're the daughter of Carol, that I was at Carol's house in Aleppo in 2006. And I looked at old pictures, and there were three young adolescent, well, some were younger, but you were like a young adolescent girls in the picture. And I said, that must be Sabine. I think we met almost 20 years ago. And yeah, and then we realized we had, which is quite amazing.
Exactly. That's all thanks to Jad Musalli's page Portraits of Aleppo. So big up to Jad Musalli. Thank you for
Yeah,
sharing Michel's picture.
yes, yes, he's been very active with that, which is amazing.
Yeah. So as you mentioned it, I saw Michel's photo, whose story I had heard my mom and grandmother like whisper while growing up, and that is how we connected. Now we're going to talk about Michel and your artwork, about him and about your family history. But maybe before we do, I wanted to ask you why did you decide as an artist to use your family history as, let's say, a material to work with?
That's a good question, because I never thought I would. In fact, I'm not one to disclose my personal stories to the public, especially through my art. What it was largely the war in Syria when that had started. We moved to the United States when I was 3 years old. So I grew up with a mixed identity, not feeling completely Syrian, not feeling completely American. And of course, coming from the Middle East, okay, at this time in the 70s and 80s, nobody really had ever heard of Syria in the United States, in New Jersey. They thought I was from a place called Cereal. So we just left it at that, who ate weird food for lunch. So growing up, I kind of dismissed the Syrian background, and I wasn't really interested in learning the language. I would listen to it, I would hear it all day, so I understood it. I wasn't interested in speaking it, or really being part of that community. Until I was around maybe 18, 19 years old, I felt a bit of regret that I don't speak the language, and then I started to speak it. Until now, I speak it, but it's not great, but I can get by. So within that time, I was very interested in going back and going to Aleppo, especially, and visiting, because, we left when I was 3, and I only had a couple of really, which is amazing. I actually do have a couple of memories of being in Meshtel and then being in the airport heading to the United States. But I never really got to learn to be there physically and to feel the city. So I had been wanting to go for a while, and then I went in 2006 when my cousins had invited me, and that's when we had met. but it was very brief, unfortunately. So I think I only spent 2 days in Aleppo and the rest of the time in Damascus and then traveling around there. But I just said to myself, I said, okay, well, I'll just come back one day. I mean, I just thought like I can just do it on my own and really take my time and really exploring Aleppo. And then of course, 5 years later, the war had started. And when the war had started, that really I never realized how connected I felt to the city until the war had started. I was waking up in the middle of the night feeling like a death, feeling like this tragedy overcoming me, overcoming my family, feeling like the place that I come from was just pulled out from under me. And that's when I really understood how connected I feel to this region, to this country, and to the city. And in the meantime, as an artist, I'd been working a lot with maps and mapping in general. And I'd been really interested in especially looking at places of rebuilding, places that have been rebuilt, especially after war. So it's kind of a coincidence that I've been working on those projects. And I just moved to Berlin at that time, which of course has a very post-war feeling. It's so tangible in the air that one can easily just grasp the sadness that permeates. And what interests me is more about like how people redefine themselves or define themselves amongst the built environment around them, and especially areas that have been rebuilt after war, and this holding on to the past. Especially in Berlin, you still see some remnants, although they've pretty much erased a lot of it and rebuilt in such a modern way, but you still see some remnants of the war, and it still affects the collective consciousness. So as I've been working a lot with mapping, this actually was not my first project about Syria. This was my second project. I'll get to my first project in a bit. But the second project was Aleppo Deconstruction Reconstruction. And that was mapping out disappearing places in Aleppo, in Syria, but mostly Aleppo, that are part of my family history. And it was a way of solidifying this destroyed landscape. So I was speaking mostly with my uncle Nabil and my mother, and Nabil especially was very helpful in locating these places on Google Earth. So I would have a list of places that I wanted to learn more about, and it was a lot of it was in the day-to-day, where I was born, where we lived, where my mother went to school, the church, the Latin cathedral, my grandfather's office. And Nabil would locate them on Google Earth, and then I took screenshots of them, and then using Illustrator, I kind of manipulated them to look like, from the top view, to make them look like bombed out areas, bombed out buildings, and then printed them, and then physically, because I can't just do prints, I went back into them with pencil and drawing and thread and tape, and almost created an emotive response to the disappearing place. But I have to say, at the time, I didn't know the state of these buildings. So we're listening to the news about the war, and my mother is speaking to relatives in Syria who had pretty much left. They'd already, the Assad family, they'd already moved to Beirut. We didn't know so much the state of the buildings, but we did know West Aleppo, where my family came from, was under Assad regime, which was still not bombed. It was still okay. But nothing was 100% known. So I was solidifying these places through these drawings, and at the same time, recording through family, mostly through my mother and my uncle Nabil, stories and memories of these places. And they would go from the day-to-day to the tragic. And the tragic, of course, well, first, the first tragedy starts when Syria and Egypt united, and it became pan-Arab, and they confiscated everybody's private property with the agrarian reform. So my grandfather, my mother's father, owned a lot of property. He was, I think, tobacco fields and cotton fields and rice fields, and everything was confiscated, and they were poor overnight. And that was very difficult for the family. That was the first. Then the second was when my uncle Michel was abducted by the Hafez al-Assad regime in 1978 in Damascus. So this story of Michel, I grew up knowing. I mean, I was only 5 years old when he disappeared, and he disappeared right after he visited us in the United States. And there's even a beautiful picture of the whole family together in our house. It was the last time everybody was together. And right after that, he went back to Syria, and I will never forget the feeling at home. The phone calls, the panic, the fear, the fear to speak also to relatives in Syria. My uncle David was there, you know, and you can't say this stuff over the phone. One could not point the finger and say it was Assad that abducted him. You had to keep everything, you know, undercover, in this very kind of neutral sense. Hmm?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, you had to use like codes and everything. I mean, when you grew up in Syria, you knew walls had ears. You know, you couldn't just.
exactly. Exactly, and that's the saying, the walls had ears. But here I was in the United States, and my mother, was interestingly enough, she didn't try to protect me from this. I mean, she explained, she said, they think he was a communist. We don't know. He got abducted. We think he's in jail, you know. So I knew all of this, but I also understood how awful these prisons are, and that he most likely was being tortured. And that was a very, very, very difficult period for the family. So while I was working on the mapping project, Michel's story, of course, especially became the real focal point. And for my Aleppo Deconstruction Reconstruction, which actually then it became a book, which I'll hold it up here. It was first an exhibition in New York at AIR Gallery, and then at Jane Lombard Gallery. And then I decided that it would be a good idea to make this into a book, because the format does, you know, their works on paper with stories connected to each map drawing lends itself very well to book form. And so I got it published by Körber Verlag. It's an art book publisher in Germany, and also had Nasser Rabat, who is the director of the Islamic architecture, the Aga Khan program at MIT, and he wrote a very brief summary of the history of Syria. And in this book, it was great to do the book because it was able to get the stories out there even more. There was a little bit of a little bit of concern from the family at first of making the story, Michel's story, public. But also there was mostly support. You know, most of the family was already in the United States, except our mutual relatives, Tanya and Benita, the Sadeh family in Beirut, and they were all supportive. I asked Nabil, I said, what do you think? I don't want to put the family at risk. And according to him, and I also felt the same way, Bashar al-Assad has a zillion people that he's fighting right now. I think the last people he's going to be putting his energy into is fighting the story that I'm making public, which actually already was somewhat public because it already was on the Amnesty International website. And there's a Syrian human rights website. Michel's story was already up there for decades. So I just felt like, are they really going to come after me? I would not feel comfortable at that time. I did not feel comfortable going to Syria. I didn't think that would have been too much of a risk. But to do this book, I just felt it's much more important to make this story known than to protect myself, since I felt like it was a very small risk. Yeah. So the mapping project then eventually became the film, A Portrait of Michel, which I had just finished now. Going back to Aleppo Deconstruction Reconstruction, it's taking 15 locations in Syria, and like I said, mostly Aleppo, and the only other places in Damascus where Michel was abducted, in the Seven Fountains Square. And because I was only touching not briefly, I mean, Michel's story was a huge part of it. That was the apex of the book. But I wanted to dive deeper into his story. And while working on this book, because I had so many interviews with family and people's reactions to Michel, to who he was as a person, to what possibly had happened to him, I started to have this title in my head. I said I wanted to work on another project specifically about Michel, and I called it A Portrait of Michel. But for a few years, I did not have a visual medium. I did not know, okay, I have these audio interviews, I have written interviews, I have different stories, but what exactly would be the visual? Because I'd been working with map drawings, I was like, I don't see this, I don't see myself working with maps for this, nor do I see myself just working with portrait portraits of Michel. We didn't have anything really that belonged to him until magically. I really feel like it was some kind of serendipitous, magical situation. It was during COVID, and we're all sitting at home trying to find things to do to keep us occupied. And, the Michel story, like I said, I had all these interviews, and my cousins, Tanya and Benito, who, of course, you know well, they were living in Beirut, and they called me out of the blue, and they said they were just back in Damascus, and they found a small pouch that belonged to Michel. And inside this pouch had random scraps of paper, his driver's license, graduation diploma, some photographs, his eyeglasses, keys, all of these random things. And that's that's mostly all we had left that belonged to Michel, besides some other things that I had found along the way. And they said, and I said, oh my God, I have to get my hands on this. Because it was COVID, they were not able to send it from Lebanon, and I actually would have been too afraid for them to mail it from Lebanon if it got lost. So they had photographed all of the objects for me. But unfortunately, it's hard to art direct over the phone how exactly I wanted them photographed. So they were just kind of taking snapshots. I was like, okay, that's not, there's things in the way. There's, glass of water next to it. I was like, no. Can you stylize it like this? So I was trying to work with what I had, but it still wasn't exactly what I wanted until maybe a year or two later. A friend of theirs who was living in Beirut was coming to Berlin for work, and she was staying in a hotel, and they gave her the pouch to take with her. And I was like, please don't let her check it in the luggage. Let her make sure she carries it on the plane. I don't want it to get lost. So I never met her, but she left it at the reception in the hotel. And I went and picked it up, and it was in this plastic bag, and I took it home, and I took out the pouch, and it's about like 50 years old. And it smells like, it smells like a basement. It's just mildewy. The zipper works, but it's kind of a little bit torn at the edges. And I take out every single piece of paper and object in there, and I was like, wow. It was chilling. And then with these objects, I photographed them how I did. I photographed them as if I were an investigator. And I was photographing each object front and back, starkly on just a white background. And no object had more importance than the other. There was an equal importance with everything in the bag. I didn't dismiss anything as, oh, this isn't important, because there was a lot of stuff that's really just scribble, just some random numbers but everything had equal importance for me. And through doing this, I started to also build the story, because there were some weird things in there too, which one will see when they watch my film. There was these list of numbers that I was very curious about that made no sense to me. So that began more of my side of the investigation. And then through that, I was revisiting the conversations that I had had with family, and also interviewing other family members like your Aunt Elba about Michel, because Elba had known him when they were friends, they were cousins, and she was quite young, I think, much younger than Michel, but she had a great, relationship with him and his girlfriend at the time. And I was just accumulating more and more stories, and also finding more just other photographs, his thesis, the thesis that we have at my mother's house, that he wrote a sweet little note to me, my brother, my sister, my mother, dedicating it to us. And at the same time, there were addresses as well. There was his address, of course, on his ID in Toulouse, because he was studying in Toulouse at the time. Well, he had just finished his studies when he went back to Syria, and some other random addresses. So I got a grant. I got a couple of grants in Berlin, in Germany, to focus on this project. And with that grant, I also took a trip to Toulouse, and I visited these places that were in his pouch, and I photographed them as well. And that was part of the investigation. The very chilling thing is that I was outside his building where he lived. I was with my sister, And I was photographed, and this is a small, it's a, small brick building outside the center near the park. And I was outside photographing it. Didn't think I was going to be able to get inside. I didn't try. I wasn't going to like ring on, I'm a bit too shy with this kind of, I'm not that assertive with photographing people's personal space. So I was outside and taking pictures and taking a video of the house and other areas where he was in his university and stuff. And when I was outside his building, this young girl came out of the building and she kind of looked over at me. I was across the street. She just sort of looked to see like, okay, what's going on? And then quickly got on her bicycle and sped away. And I remember thinking, oh gosh, I wish I was fast enough to just say, hey, can you let me inside your building? I would, and explain my story, but I didn't do it. But I went back to the hotel with my sister, and we both sort of regretted because she said the same. She's like, oh, I wish I would have said something to that woman. I said, yeah, me too. And I'm looking at the pictures and I realized there was this lens flare, which I did not notice as I was taking the pictures, that was on every single picture of the building. And I wasn't happy with them. I mean, in a photograph, I can retouch it, but in the video, it wasn't going to work. So we decided, okay, let's just go back tomorrow. So I went back the next day, and as I'm photographing, this elderly couple is standing on the balcony. And I have to point out that this is a small apartment building, which only has, now I found out afterwards, has 3 apartments, 1 on each floor. So there's only like 3 different tenants. I mean, there's other people that live with them, but 3 apartments. So the chances of being there 2 days in a row and having somebody walk out or stand outside is very slim. This elderly couple stands on the balcony and asks me what I'm doing. And my sister speaks better French than I do. And she explained to them, she's like, oh, this is my sister. She's working on a project about her uncle who disappeared, under Assad and da, 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 da. And they were very intrigued by the story. And they let me in, they let us in the building, which was amazing. They let us in the building, let me photograph the building. They let us into their apartment. They only wanted me to photograph the outside, the courtyard. They didn't want me to, which was okay. I respected that. I was inside their apartment, and I swear, I thought to myself, this could probably have been Michel's apartment. There was something so chilling about it, that how it happened, how coincidentally that, as I said, 2 times in a row I'm there, and it was almost like I'm giving this opportunity to go inside. And since there's only 3 apartments there, there's a 33% chance that could have been his. That I will never know, but I do know that he walked inside that door. He did walk up the stairs. He did look out the window and see that courtyard. And that to me was really magical. And that I also included in my film. So yeah, so that was kind of the birth of that project.
So when you collected that pouch and when, let's say, you started seeing this material, did you immediately know that the medium was going to be a movie, or did it kind of become clear while you were starting to collect all the voices, the recordings, the photographs? How did it come about?
That's a good question, because I normally don't work in film. So for me to say I'm going to make a movie would just, it felt a bit unnerving, just because this is not my usual medium. Because I had just finished this book, at first I was seeing it, I was at first referring to it as a video. I think I felt more comfortable calling it a video than a film. A film is something that just feels a bit more just engaged with many different, actors in it and different voices and more, produced. This is very lo-fi, very homemade. I saw it in a way as a moving book. I didn't want to do another book. And I didn't want to do something similar to Aleppo Deconstruction Reconstruction, with making stories that are connected to an image. But I did see something visually on screen that would move, that would almost like flip through pages. So I did, as a video, before I called it a film, thought that this was the best way to get this thing in motion, of having the stories. And at first I wasn't using the audio interviews. I was just using text. Using text excerpts from interviews alongside some of the images. And at the same time, I I had rediscovered, because I had seen it before, an old family video, which is amazing. A relative of mine came from Boston by boat from Massachusetts in 1946 to Syria and Lebanon and visited the family. And he had an 8mm camera and filmed the family probably over one weekend. And a cousin of mine digitized it. And I revisited that and I thought, what a beautiful archival piece of history we have here. Seeing the family in 1946, these are really the golden years for my family, at least in Syria, for a lot of people. They were singing and dancing and dressed beautifully, and in Lebanon in the summer. And there's just this, and the way there was just this community between them. It was a huge, like, extended family of relatives and cousins, maybe 20, 25, 30 people in these videos. And when I found that and rediscovered it, I said, okay, the medium has to be a film. I mean, and it was an interesting way for me to tell this story, because it wasn't just focusing on the here and now and Michel's story, but also going back in memory about in my family history and in those what I call to the golden years. And Michel was born at that time. I don't see him in the video. He's only 2 years old, but he was definitely there because my grandmother was there. So he was there somewhere. And the trajectory of a family, which I think most people can relate to. There's a lot of course, tragedies, but when you come from the Middle East, you experience a lot more than
level of tragedies when you come from the Middle East.
Exactly. Most every family has a story. So that's where it was. I decided this has to be a film, and there was a lot of trial and error of how to do it. As I said before, I was a little bit too, I was focusing more on the written material, the written interviews. I mean, I had the audio, but I was using it because I was so used to doing the book and the other project that it was more just text. But then it became too long. I mean, it didn't become too long. It became too long for it to be text only. I mean, if it's 10 minutes, 15 minutes, fine. But now it's 43 minutes. And I think to give the viewer a break, I had to include the audio interviews. But as I said, the intention was never to make a film. So the audio interviews were very lo-fi. They were very kind of on the fly. Here, I'm at Uncle Nabil's house. We go into another room, but you can hear people in the background. I'm recording him. I'm on the phone with Elba, your aunt, over WhatsApp, and she's telling me stories. So I had to work with that and clean them, work with an audio engineer to make them as good as possible, and accept that they are lo-fi, but that's part of the story, and then through that, there was a lot of trial and error. But once I understood the rhythm of how I wanted to make the film, focusing on the objects and having this sort of urgency and how the objects come up for some seconds, and then it skips to the next, and it skips to the next, skips to the next, and then interspersed with the audio and the old family video. Then I understood the rhythm. I think the timing was one of the most difficult things to get right with the film. Not difficult, but the most that I kept going back and forth, like how long should this piece be up for? 5 seconds or 6 seconds? When should this object or this piece of paper flash on the screen? Should it be while Pauline's speaking or when she finishes that word? Because I wanted there to be a relationship, but not too close of a relationship. You run the risk of it being too literal, so it had to have enough abstraction and distance from what they're saying, and at the same time, be part of the story.
I think it works really well. I mean, I've seen it. I'm not going to spoil it, but I think it works really well. And for me, it was also a way of actually learning about Michel, because I've heard these stories about him, but I obviously didn't know him because I wasn't born at the time. And it was like a way of kind of building not just the story, but also the whole kind of, setting of his life, the context in which he kind of was abducted, and the whole, family situation around it, which is really moving. And it's also a testimony of, it's one story of a person who has been abducted under the Assad regime, but there are so many other people who have also who went through this. So it's a way of, kind of um, anchoring this experience for Syrians in general, this kind of unspoken trauma that I found really touching. And was it in any way, I guess this is my question, following all of this, was it this project in any way cathartic to you and to the family?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, and that's the word that I always use. I always say it's cathartic. And the family feels the same way. They are very proud that the story is out there. Uh, it does make them very emotional, but like my mother says, I'm just quoting her, she's like, "Bravo, Christine." She's like, it's, we never know what happened to Michel, but now you're making his story heard.
Hmm.
And that's very important, that he's not just another one of these people. It's about the individual that disappeared in the Assad's prison. It's about attaching a face and a family and a story to that specific individual. And I think it's, the family, since he was abducted for probably at least the first 20 years, it was still, there was hope that he was going to be found. Um, which I speak a little bit about that in my film. And then and then I think it was just accepted. It was accepted that he disappeared. And my mother used to always say, and maybe this sounds cold, but I don't blame her. She's like, I hope he's not alive. We don't want to, even now with the release of prisoners, it would be so sad, so traumatic to see him if he were released from prison, if he were there for the last
Yeah,
45
60
years.
years, 50
So
years
40,
now.
yeah,
And yeah.
yeah, yeah. No, he would be right now. He would be 80. What was he? He was born in 1946, so he would be almost 80.
Hmm.
And he would not be that same person, obviously,
Yeah.
that we have a memory of.
Hmm.
And after all that trauma, who would he be? What would he do? It's not a life.
Hmm.
So we don't think he's alive.
Yeah.
And because there was news in the beginning, we did hear, which I talk about in the film, there were some stories of people seeing him in prison. But, like we said earlier, the Syrians are afraid to speak.
Hmm.
There's one story that I talk about in the film, that one prisoner got released, and we heard that this prisoner got released maybe in the early 80s, late 70s, and knew Michel, and Michel had a letter for him to give to the family. And when the mother of this prisoner found the letter, she was so afraid to get involved in what would happen to her and her family under Assad, that she tore up the letter, and nobody ever knew what the letter had said.
Yeah.
And that was
I
the
mean,
closest to getting any information of what had happened to him.
no.
So,
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, yeah, it's like I get goosebumps whenever, you we get to hear these stories about yeah, the Assad regime and now that he's fallen, everything all these stories are kind of coming out, and we're hearing a lot of similar testimonies from a lot of families and a lot of people. And um, you mentioned earlier that when you started working on this, you were kind of afraid that it might have some kind of repercussions on family members who were still living in Syria, and you kind of made sure that they were okay with your work. But even when you're abroad, sometimes this kind of work can entail some kind of tension or pressure from even Syrians, because the Syrian regime kind of created this, um, let's say, sense of fear. So people would start also silencing other people for speaking up about this oppressive system. Did you ever feel at any point that there was this kind of tension? Did anyone kind of try to silence you or to kind of, you know, uh, let's say, tune down your work or change the narrative in any way?
I did. Coincidentally, which I didn't even realize, I was invited to do a Zoom presentation. This was during COVID, about my book, Aleppo Deconstruction Reconstruction, and it was by a university in Frankfurt. And he was organizing a conference with architects and urban planners about rebuilding Syria and rebuilding Aleppo. And he had discovered my book, I think, in the library there, and thought it would be interesting to bring an artist to for me to talk about my stories and my book and my project. I had no background information. I did not know, and nor do I think this way, because largely I'm American. I'm thinking as a Syrian, one is more afraid when they're in Syria, not as for somebody to be outside of Syria. I was reading stories, so it was over Zoom. I didn't know who the other guests were, and I was reading stories from my book. And when I started to read about Michel and his abduction, and it was quoting my uncle Nabil, and he's basically naming that Hafiz al-Assad abducted him, and that this is what happened under the brutal, in the brutal prisons of the Assad regime, where people get lost in prison for maybe just even speaking against the government. All of a sudden, I just felt it as I was speaking over Zoom. I felt for some reason something is happening. I just felt like there was some tension going on behind the screen. I don't know how to explain it. Because normally I'd done a book presentation with it and I could just tell when people were engaged. But here I was like, something is not working. And all of a sudden I get cut off by the moderator. And he's like, okay, Christine, thank you very much. As I'm mid-sentence, okay, that's enough. We're going to go on to the next guest. And I was a little bit annoyed. I was like, why did they invite me and then just cut me off? Then I found out later through my friend Dima, who's a Syrian architect that lives from Aleppo that lives in Berlin. She was also part of the conference, so she was there. And she's like, Christine, she called me after. She's like, Christine, you have no idea. She said, while you were reading, people were terrified. These are people that were living and working in Syria. Oh, wow. And they were through the chat saying, what is this girl saying? Please stop this conversation. We did not know that this was going to be political. And I just got completely cut off. And then the moderator, the organizer, sent me a message and he apologized and explained what had happened. But that was the first time I had experienced that. And then I understood that, yes, I have to be careful with where I'm invited to speak about this and who else is, who's in the audience or who else is presenting their work. Because like I said, living in New York or in Germany or in Berlin, this is not something that I think of. I was thinking more of, oh, I hope my relatives in Syria will be okay. Not thinking that I would have this influence from here.
Yeah, absolutely. And then now in the context of today and what has happened barely 2 months ago, what does the fall of the Assad regime represent, well, for you, for the family, and also for Michel, or for his memory at least?
We're going to try to get information, or we are. My uncle Nabil is working on that. There is, okay, well, what is the fall of the Assad regime, of course, was taken with such joy and surprise, and thank God this regime is over. And thank God these prisoners are being released, and there's hope for the rebuilding of Syria. There is hope for Syria. What it represents with Michel's story is now maybe we can get some answers. I don't know how organized they were with their files, with keeping information about their prisoners, especially Michel's time under Hafez, maybe a little bit more under Bashar, because then also stuff was probably computerized. I don't know if we could even find the files about Michel or if they kept them. They could have been destroyed. But I'm also thinking that I would like to continue this project, to go to Syria and try to get some answers. And when we did find out about the fall of Assad, my uncle Nabil had already gotten in touch with people that he knows in Syria, in Damascus, people of influence, to see if they can help find Michel, to meet ex-prisoners, prisoners that have been released, because there were prisoners. Some prisoners that were released were in prison for the same period of Michel, 45, 50 years, to see if they knew him. So there is now this idea of maybe looking for answers. At the same time, there's trepidation. I will work on it because I feel like I have to, because the answers could be there. But there's also trepidation because, as I said earlier, the answers aren't going to be healing. The answers would be more traumatic. We know what happened. We know he was in prison. We know he was abducted. We know he was imprisoned, and we know he was brutally beaten and abused in prison. We just don't know how he died. to get all of that information I don't know if that would be healing. I think it would I think it would just bring the trauma back. But at the same time, I feel like we have to. And we have to still see if maybe he is alive, although we really doubt it. But maybe he is and he has no memory of who he is. We don't know.
It might also bring some closure in a way because, we also never got any answers on why he was abducted and what were the suspicions, what was the base of this. I mean, obviously, with the Assad regime, you couldn't. It could be anything, and it could also be nothing. So, but yeah, I mean, I guess it kind of brings a bit of hope of feeling that maybe you can have some answers and like move on, but not necessarily move on in the sense of forgetting about it, but of actually, let's say, creating a full picture of his memory and his life, maybe.
It is. It's true. I mean, if we do find out, it would, it's not like it would close the story, but it would close that chapter in a way that, okay, now we understand what happened. Because now we just ruminate, like, was it this? Was it that? Could have been this. It could have been that. We don't know. And a lot of times, like you said, it could have been nothing. I mean, one theory was that because he was in the Syrian embassy in Paris when he needed to renew his passport, needed to get some paper in his passport to visit the United States. And this is 1977 in France, where he was living in France and he was left-wing. And he forgot that when you're in the Syrian embassy in Paris, you were actually in Syria. You don't speak like a Frenchman, And he walked in and saw a big photograph of Hafez al-Assad and cursed out this photograph and said, we have to see his face everywhere we go. And then the man told him, he's like, you're going to suffer a brutal fate when you go back to Syria. And Michel, of course, didn't take it seriously. And then we found out later that man worked for the Secret Service. And he wrote a report about Michel. And it could have really just been that. I mean, we don't know. We don't know. And if it were just that, would the man from the Secret Service just claim it was that? Or would they invent a story as well?
Yeah. Yeah, I think
so even if we find out, we wouldn't even know what's true and what's not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm wondering also, in the light of what has been happening today, what is it like for you as an artist? And more specifically, maybe as an Arab artist, what is it like to be living in Berlin in light of Germany's positioning with the genocide in Gaza and them being over, let's say, pro-Israel?
It's not easy. It's really not easy. I had a lot of respect with how Germany was dealing with their history, how Germans were dealing with their history, how they were facing it, how they were talking about it, how they were trying to do good, how they were bringing in the refugees. I mean, I know Merkel's decision wasn't 100% accepted by a lot of people, but it was still a very good act, a good deed. And a lot of, especially, I'm just going to speak about the Syrians. A lot of the Syrians who've been there, my God, I mean, they're so thankful, so grateful. They learn the language, they speak it fluently, they're working, and they're appreciative. Of course, you have like a few isolated incidents with these refugees, like what's happening now with these incidents with people getting run over and stuff. What's happening right now in Gaza and the German reaction to me is it's mind-numbing. Every time I'm especially with social networking, and I'm seeing how Germany it's not like I'm learning about only through social networking, but right now I'm in New York and I'm seeing, okay, what happened at the Berlinale, and what's her name, that actress, I'm blanking out now, who won the award and made a great speech, and now of course she's considered
Nan Goldin's
well, there's
speech.
Nan Goldin, of course. Nan Goldin made a beautiful speech, and I was there for that. Thank God for that. Tilda Swinton, who I was just talking about, the more recent one. But of course, they get labeled as anti-Semites, and this label is diluted the word. I mean, you have Jews who are being labeled as anti-Semites by the Germans.
Yeah.
It's almost like a comedy. How can they feel so bold enough after their history to be arresting Jews for protesting in defense of the Palestinians? And It's difficult for me. It's I don't know what's going to happen in the United States. It's not looking good here either. And of course, Trump is the biggest fan of Israel and as we know, not a supporter of the Palestinians. So I'm not saying here is better. I just don't know where to go right now. I do have a nice, good community of friends that are very vocal and pro-Palestinian, but I have to say I'm very disappointed in the German voice because there is none. The Germans are the first to be on the streets when the arts funding is cut. You see thousands of people protesting against the arts funding. And you see thousands of people protesting against the rise of the AfD, the right-wing party. But when it comes to supporting the Palestinians, I've gone to these demonstrations. It's mostly Middle Easterns, other Europeans or Canadians, Americans. The amount of Germans, maybe 1%. Very few Germans. And is it really just because of their history? Honestly, I really don't know. The media there is so twisted. The media frames anybody. And I also have to be cautious when I go to these demonstrations because I'm under, I have a permanent residency. I can't say anything. I just go. I'm allowed to go. But I'm quiet. I just go and I'm there with them as support. There's many phrases that are forbidden to say, which I can't even say it now. There's no freedom of speech in Germany. The only freedom of speech one has is if you just support Israel. That's it. And of course, all of this. All of these artists, all of these exhibitions are getting canceled. Germany is making a joke of itself. And it's actually really heartbreaking because when I moved there in 2012 and up until and through Merkel's reign with bringing in the refugees, I was really proud of that country. I really felt like these Germans really know how to deal with their history and they're honest with themselves. And now I feel like they are, I don't know, is it just they're traumatized from their history? Or do they not like to get out of their comfort zone? And for them, why are they going to fight something that's happening in another land? I don't know. I really don't know. And again, I'm not speaking about all of them. There's a lot of Germans that are upset about this and protesting. And those are also friends that I have. But I say the majority, and with the help of the media and the help of the government, it is so slanted to label anybody that is supportive of the Palestinians as an anti-Semite, which is such a ridiculous, and I have Jewish friends there. I mean, it's such a ridiculous label. And as we all know, I mean, it's happening in the United States as well, but not as bad. But it will. I mean, under Trump, I'm not confident the same's not going to happen. These protests could become illegal.
Yeah, it is kind of sad, especially considering that Berlin is a kind of, well, was, I don't know if it's still going to be a hub for arts and artists. But, being an artist and living through heavy censorship kind of is paradoxical. So I guess it's going to have some, heavy impact on the cultural and the artistic scene in the country. But yeah. I mean, we're gonna
Absolutely.
live to see some very big transitions, I guess, in the near future.
Yeah, no,
Um,
absolutely. I think between that and the cutback, the 12% cutback in the arts in Berlin, and I think a lot of artists are boycotting Germany. I don't think Berlin is going to be an artistic hub for much longer. I think and I think it's already over. It's sad. They really just they dug their own grave. And it's unfortunate because one has to always say, if we say anything in defense of the Palestinians, we have to talk about October 7th. October 7th was horrible. What Hamas did was horrible. I mean, of course, there could be some isolated people that are supportive of it. Majority of people think this whole thing, how it started, was horrible. But the repercussions this is completely unbalanced. But one in Germany could not have any sympathy towards the Palestinians without first starting every sentence with, I condemn Hamas, and October 7th.
yeah, that's indeed where we are at today, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Well, Christine, we're kind of reaching the end of our conversation, but before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you, where can our listeners perhaps watch your most recent work, A Portrait of Michel? Is it going to be projected at any exhibition or at any fair anytime soon?
Yes. Actually, I have I'm going to have 3 screenings in April here in New York and in Germany, in Berlin as well. So in April, on April 10th, I'm going to show it at Union Docs, which is a great documentary center in Ridgewood, Queens. And April 13th, I'm going to show it at the Francis Kite Club, which is sort of the social club art event space started by this woman, Laura Rakovich. Well, she's one of the founders, who used to direct the Queens Museum. And I'm going to have a talk with the curator, Barbara Pollock. And then there's a third venue, which we're right now talking with, which I won't say the name yet until it's firm, but I always post stuff on social networking so people can follow me on Instagram or Facebook, and I will definitely post stuff there. And so right now the film's not public. I'm not, but one is welcome to send me an email, and I would be happy to send a link to watch the film. But you can watch at least a trailer on my website. And but yeah, I welcome people to get in touch with me and happy to share it that way.
Brilliant.
Oh, and then I didn't mention, and in Berlin. I'm going to show it in Berlin at, I know, I was like, there's something else I'm supposed to say, at Vincent Sala Gallery in Wilmersdorf. And that's going to be maybe in the late spring or summer. And that too, I'll post on social networking when I know exactly the date. And then there's other things hopefully coming up. So I'm reaching out to a lot of people. So I'm hoping it can be shown as much as it can, especially right now while the news about Syria is still, you know, very pertinent.
Actually, maybe talking about that, Syria has become really a hot topic, you know, in the past couple of months. Do you feel it has changed the, let's say, not the perception, but kind of the positioning of certain people towards your work? Do you feel that more people are reaching out to you, are more interested in your work because of what's happened a couple of months ago?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, with my film, I finished a Portrait of Michel earlier last year, and I've been reaching out to people, and people liked it, but there was just no place for it yet. You know, I actually had one gallerist say, oh, well, Syria's not really in the news anymore. It's like, okay, so Syria's not in the news anymore. That means nothing is happening there. I mean, you know, I was a bit bothered by that, but that's how trends go, right? When the fall of Assad was announced in December, I thought, oh my God, and seeing these prisoners getting released, and I was like, my story of Michel is so pertinent right now. I have to really strike while the iron's hot. And I have to say, because of that is why I've now been getting such great reaction and actually getting dates to first screening instead of, oh, this looks great, we'll see, we'll let you know. And now it's like, no, we need to show this now. So there is an urgency, which I'm happy about. So it has definitely helped my work.
Yeah, well, I'm very happy we got to have this conversation and we got to discover your work, Christine. I hope I'll get to maybe come to one of the screenings in Berlin, as I'm not too far.
That would be wonderful. One thing, I am going to show it also the first weekend in May, Berlin Art Weekend, Taswir Projects, but that's a smaller event. I don't know how open to the public, but I'll also post that. That's in Berlin. I don't know how many people that can fit, but she wants to screen it as well. It's in her home, and she organizes these events around Middle Eastern artists. Shulamit is her name. So I'm going to show it there as well. But again, everything will be on social networking.
Thank you so much for your time. And
thank you so much, Sabine. It was really great.